So it's a great honor for me to interview Jonathan Balcombe. So thank you for taking the time to do this. So I know you have been working with many animal protection organizations, but also worked in academia, and you have written several books on animal behavior. Could you perhaps begin by saying something about the development in ethology in the last decades?
Yeah, I like to say that it's an exciting time to be an ethologist, somebody who studies animal behavior, because for much of the 20th century, scientists didn't like asking questions about what animals think and how they feel. And that has changed in the last 20 years or so. And now scientists are asking questions like, can a starling be optimistic and pessimistic? Can an insect feel pain? Obviously, some of these studies are disturbing because they may cause discomfort or pain to the animals. But it's very important and helpful, I think, that the questions are being asked. I would like science to be more creative in coming up with non-harmful ways of studying these things. And I think, scientists are very innovative and clever at that. But it's definitely good because this information begins to leach into society at large. So I think it's one of the ways that public opinion can be changed is if people realize that that animal isn't just alive, that animal has a life that matters to him or her.
Yeah, because I know I've read also Frans de Waal, and he speaks a lot about how it was like in the 70s. You wouldn't even talk about emotions in animals, right?
That's right. It was just a taboo subject that animals had internal lives. If you'd asked scientists over a beer in the bar, in the pub, they probably would say, oh, yeah, sure. But in the scholarly papers and the discussion that they have in the academic sphere, no, not accepted.
Right. But that has changed.
Yeah, it has changed. Yep. We're in a new era now. Thank goodness. About time.
Right. So many listening to this channel, I think, are into animal advocacy. Are there some things in ethology that you would like to give us, maybe 3 suggestions that might be good in our work?
Well, I think knowledge and awareness is always helpful. That's why I spend a lot of energy writing books that make the information from science available to non-scientists. So you get rid of the jargon, get rid of the fancy words, and try to explain things in a simple, lucid manner, because people are intelligent, they can understand it. It's just that in academia there tends to be a lot of language that's not suitable for general public. So I think reading books by people like Carl Safina and Frans de Waal and me, and so knowing about the animals is really important and helpful. I think science itself needs to be constantly on its toes to be more progressive. As I've said, some of the methods used in science to study animals are a bit harmful to the animals, and that's kind of disturbing. So I'd like to see that changed. I don't know if I have a third one, but I guess maybe we should be very open-minded about the capacities for different animals. We are very good as a species at compartmentalizing, putting things in different categories. And for instance, there's been a tendency, at least among scientists, I don't know if I speak for the non-scientists, but invertebrates, animals without backbones, we've separated them out and considered them as not worthy of our concern and ethics. And now there's new information coming out that octopuses and squids, for instance, have a great deal of mental and emotional capacity. And I've just finished writing a book on insects. It's not out yet. It'll be coming out this year, on flies, actually. And one of the reasons I wanted to write that book is because there's some very interesting science on things like a fruit fly, tiny little fruit fly has an attention span, can get tired of the same thing, and then you give them something new and their mind, their brain sparks and they're more interested in that. They sing songs when they're courting, and they do all sorts of amazing things, and I write about this in my book. So I would say the third thing would be to be not too quick to categorize animals as not being having a life, not having experiences.
In my mind, one of the things that we humans do a lot is to, as you say, compartmentalize, especially we humans and all other animals, right? Because we are, of course, an animal too. But also to demean or say that animals can't do what we do, as we said about emotions, but also cognitive abilities and so on. Yep. Would that, to lessen the gap between humans and other animals, would that be something that ethology can give us?
Narrowing that gap is absolutely something that ethology can give us, and I think it takes progressive-minded ethologists like me to urge ethologists to be more open about the comparisons and the fact that we're on a continuum and that we're all related. And by the same way, when I say on a continuum, I don't mean to imply that we humans are at the pinnacle. Other animals may have emotions that we don't have, and there's no question that other animals have in some cases, have more keen senses. Their vision may be better, their sense of smell, their sense of hearing. Doesn't it follow from that their sense of pain and pleasure may also be, in some of those domains, may also be more acute? And so we should not be assuming that we are the top of the heap.
Right. You also touched on something that I have been thinking about, and that's how we learn about animals. Many times researchers keep them in captivity and maybe subject them to pain, and we also have zoos where we learn about animals, but that comes with also captivity and perhaps putting them through pain. And for me that's a tricky question. I like that we learn more about animals, but can we do it in a way that doesn't harm animals or kill them?
Yeah, I think we must find ways. My kind of rule of thumb, my standard is that if it's an experiment we wouldn't do with another human, then we ought not do it to a rat or a mouse or maybe even a cricket. So I think we have a clear sense of ethical standard. The trouble is, one of the rubs is that we humans can give consent. We can sign a form and say, look, I know, or when we go to the dentist, I know it's going to hurt, but I know you're trying to help me. And maybe that's another standard that we should always apply, is don't do it to an animal if it's going to cause pain and we're not trying to help the animal. I think veterinarians learning to do veterinary medicine by attending and then gradually assisting with surgeries that are intended to help the animal is a perfectly ethical way to train somebody. Taking a healthy animal and making the animal ill or injuring the animal is not an ethical way to do it. So I think that's definitely a very clear direction that science needs to move in.
And yeah, you say, which is correct, of course, that we humans can give consent, but if you take a human child, maybe that would be because they can't consent or not give consent, right?
Yes, right. And the human child, it would be, what philosophers would call a marginal case, or somebody who is severely, severely mentally handicapped, say. And we have this intrinsically understood ethical stance that it is not right, because even though the baby can't give consent, and maybe because they can't, or the mentally enfeebled can't judge on what it's okay to do to them, we have a clear sense that it's wrong to harm them. And so isn't it interesting? It goes back to that compartmentalization, that we don't typically apply the same type of standard, the same type of broad ethical instinct, if you like, to non-human animals who clearly are normal and functioning and clearly have good senses and can feel things.
Would it be fair to say that you are against animal exploitation?
It's absolutely fair. I'm proud and happy to say that I'm against animal exploitation. I think any being that can feel, that's sentient, a capacity to feel good or bad, should be on the moral landscape, and therefore we should be respectful of them, and exploiting them is just wrong-headed.
And in academia, if you share that opinion with maybe your colleagues when you have been in academia, is there anyone that thinks that you're not neutral since you take the sides of the animals, you're not neutral in your science or your teaching? Does that happen?
Sure, and I'm ready to be called not neutral. I'm proudly non-neutral. I don't want to be neutral on something as important as the ethics of how we treat other sentient beings, any more so than we apply that to humans, and that's accepted, that we should be respectful and ethical about how we apply moral standards to our species. So I would say, why should we feel less strength and less committed to extending that ethic to other sentient creatures?
But isn't there maybe also a value in science that you keep neutral, you don't take a stand because you want to seek the truth? Right. In every experiment or whatever you do in science?
Yes, I think it's very important that science be skeptical, and that we be careful not to overinterpret and not to rush to conclusions when we don't know for sure why something might be happening. But part of that is also not dismissing the more complex explanation. Sometimes the more complex explanation is the right one. sometimes if we see a mouse doing something that looks like it's smart, maybe it is because it's smart. But I think it's important that science do be mindful of other possibilities. So always consider the other possible explanations for things as part of science, and I think that's an important part of science. But I don't like the Occam's razor and the tendency for science to take the least I can't quite think of the word, the least sophisticated explanation, and then sit with that one until we know better, which is what science has been prone to doing. I think we should apply the precautionary principle, which is, when in doubt, give the benefit of the doubt to the animal or the creature or whoever who might be injured and harmed if we didn't think that way.
Right. I read in Frans de Waal's latest book, Mama's Last Hug. Have you read it, by the way?
I have, yes.
Yeah. And he says, well, as we have organs in our body, like many of other mammals, of course, and other animals, they are quite the same or similar. Yeah. In the same way, we have similar emotions, and should be interpreted as similar if we don't have anything else that shows very much of difference.
That makes Frans de Waal one of the more forward-thinking scientists. Now, interestingly, in that book, Mama's Last Hug, he does write quite a bit about the harm done by eating animals. And I was glad to see that, because I approached him about 10 years ago for an endorsement, or at least a comment on a book that I had written, and he was very supportive of the book from a scientific perspective, but he said he was unable to endorse it because it was too because it looked like I was advocating not eating animals.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if I approached him today if it would be a different response, and I don't say that to criticize him. I say that just as an illustration of how we've been very reluctant to extend this ethic to when it comes to what we eat. That's looked at on as too sacred a terrain, and yet 98 out of every 100 animals that humans kill is to be eaten. So until we address that issue, we're really spinning our wheels.
So you are here in Sweden and here in Linköping to give a talk tomorrow at Linköping Vego, which is a veg fest here. And as I understand it, you will be speaking about animals' capacity to enjoy life and feel happiness. But farmers might say that really animals in the wild are suffering. I mean, they face harsh weather, they face starvation and predators. And they say, well, we farmers who keep the animals, we give them food, we give them shelter, we take care of them from danger. We actually give them a better life than they would have in the wild. What would you say about that?
I would say possibly they might give them a safer life, but a better life. I would say, these animals in farming situations are permanently confined, often extremely confined. Pig farrowing crates and veal stalls. I don't know if the veal stalls still exist in Europe, but I suspect they do. Very confined situation, and the frustration of natural behaviors. So that's a severe hardship, and really it's a bit disingenuous to suggest that they have a longer life. I don't know if that's what you said, but a better life. The chickens are sent to slaughter when they're still chicks. They're just large chicks, and they're selectively bred to grow fast. They're not even barely in their adolescence. And pigs and cows, pigs are 5 to 7 months, I believe. They're still in their first year of life when they're sent to the slaughterhouse. So farmers can't claim that they have a better or a longer life. In the wild, sure, there are hazards to face, but the animal is free, and part of the richness of life is that there are vicissitudes in life. There are pluses and minuses, and there are challenges, but the animal gets to make his or her own decision and gets to explore, to forage, to find mates, to find food, to seek cover. Absolutely there's challenges, but it's a real life, a meaningful life for the animal, and it's a life that they lead independently, and it's not a life cut short by us.
Maybe one misconception could be that they should be lucky because we give them food, but maybe that's something they miss out on actually searching for food. Isn't that one of their needs to actually search, not only to get food but to go for it?
Yeah, that's actually been shown. There's a name for that. It's called Contrafreeloading. Freeloading, of course, taking free food when it's made available to you, and we all understand that. We know what that's like. And some animals in some settings will do that going to a dump or garbage area and getting food that way. But if contrafreeloading is the phenomenon whereby an animal, say in captivity in a cage, is given free food in little tins or what have you, little dish of free food, but also sprinkling the food, hiding it around the little cage, and the animal will ignore the free food, the freely available food in the cup or the bowl, and will explore around to find the food that's hidden. So it's called contrafreeloading, and it's been shown with certainly rats and mice in laboratory situations. I think other species as well, and it does show exactly as you say that there is a reward, that it's meaningful and pleasurable for animals to go seeking. Why else do they dig on the end of the cage, on the corners of the cage? They want to get out. And a big part of why they want to get out is because they're confined, and a big part of that is that they want to go forage. They want to go do their normal thing.
And also maybe building a nest or a home for themselves. Isn't that like for pigs? I know that's a strong urge, isn't
Very strong urge to build a nest and a bed. And it's just another example of something that we typically thwart to them when we keep them in factory farms and other captive settings. The typical housing situation for a mouse in a lab, and then we're talking tens of millions worldwide, is what's called a shoebox cage, and it's barely the size of a shoebox. And it's typically got a little bit of bedding, usually no stimulus, nothing to play with. There's some people in the industry trying to motivate a change in that, but it's really, a lot of scientists are reluctant because they want everything standardized and everything the same, even though it's been shown that no matter how hard you try to standardize and have everything the same, biological variation completely overrides that.
So in the Swedish animal protection law, it says clearly that animals that we use for food, that the animals should be able to behave naturally. Is that even possible, you think, in the way we have the animals used for food today?
It is, maybe not completely naturally, any more than an animal in a zoo can live completely naturally. But some countries are making some efforts that are positive. I've been in the train in the middle of England and seen these lots in fields where there's a house for each pig, or they may be kept in small groups, even better, because you get social interactions that way. And they have an area outside where they can run. It's all outdoors. Now, I don't know if it's like that year-round and what they provide for them when it gets cold in the winter, so obviously there's a lot of considerations, but definitely we can do so much better. Obviously, I look forward to the day when we don't keep animals in confinement at all and we don't have slaughterhouses anymore, because we've come to our senses and we have other ways of feeding ourselves. And certainly here in the West, in developed nations, there's a real revolution beginning in that with the technology of plant-based meats and then lab-grown meats. So, but definitely in the meantime, while we are keeping and eating animals, we could do so much better to improve the quality of their lives.
You have written the book What a Fish Knows. But even in the animal rights movement, fishes are not talked about very much, and perhaps that's sometimes a strategic reason for that, because we humans tend not to feel so much for fishes as we do maybe with pigs and cows, because maybe they're more different than us.
Yes.
What's your view on that, and how can we stand up for the fishes better in the animal rights movement, you think?
Yeah, our diminishing of fish and putting them in the bottom of all the vertebrates is one of the motivations why I wanted to write that book. I've been aware of that attitude, and I became aware of some really tremendously interesting scientific studies that show that fishes think creatively, that they solve problems, that they recognize things, they remember, they do referential signaling, they cooperate, they collaborate, they show virtue, many
do
things.
art even.
They do art even, yes, thanks for mentioning that. It's a long list and a growing one. So definitely, having spent 5 years studying about and researching what is known about fish, I became utterly convinced that they are equals among vertebrates, that they are no lower on the echelon. We could even argue they're more highly evolved because they've been evolving longer. And they're supremely complex and fascinating. Clearly, they're subjects of a life, to use a philosophical term. They have meaningful lives with emotions, and they can get stressed, and they will seek caresses and pleasure to get de-stressed, and a lot of the stuff that we can really relate to as sentient beings ourselves. So, my conclusion is we have no basis from science or anything else to relegate fishes to the basement of vertebrate life. Again, we categorize. They deserve to be as much in our minds and our concerns as any other animal.
And I really enjoyed reading your book, and I also appreciated that you, in the last part of the book, speak about what we humans do to the fishes. Would you say something about that, the fishing industry and also farming of fishes?
Yeah, it's horrible what we do. Fishes caught in the wild are typically caught in nets or on hooks, and in either case they don't die an easy death. If they're in nets, they die from crushing in the net, from the weight of sometimes 100,000 or more other fish in the net. They may die of decompression as if they're brought from great depths, where the swim bladder, an organ inside, expands as the pressure gets lower and crushes neighboring organs and other things like that. They often die of suffocation on the boat deck. That's the most common way, and often they're cut by knives to be bled. So they may die of bleeding. None of those are humane deaths. None of those are, I mean, maybe there's no such thing as a humane death, but there's certainly inhumane deaths, and all of those are. In fish aquaculture, fish farming operations, it's not really any better. And then you get into the question is of not just the death, but what's the quality of life like? And it's crowded. It's like factory farming on land. The animals are deprived of basic behavioral needs. Very stressful. Often, if it's in sea pens, they get sea lice and other parasites that thrive. So they put pesticides in there, which is another stressor for them. Competition for food, so a lot of fish become depressed and stop eating, and they just die that way. So neither is good. And one other point I like to make is that one might think that at least with fish farming we're taking the pressure off of wild populations, but in fact most of the fishes that people like to eat are predatory fish that are higher on the food chain, tunas and salmon and such. And so what are they fed in these fish farms? They're fed wild caught fish. They're fed herrings and menhaden and maybe anchovies and some of these other smaller fish that are caught in massive numbers, billions and tens of billions. So the whole fish thing and fishing problem is very widespread, and the numbers of animals involved are huge. Estimated as anything conservatively as of a few 100 billion a year to upwards of possibly over 1 or 2 trillion.
That really struck me when I learned about that. If you talk about numbers, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe 99% of all the animals we use for food, aren't they? In the individuals are fish.
Yeah.
Fishes are.
Yeah, that's a fair statement.
So you could argue that if we animal rights activists want to do something for animals, fish would be.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. Suffering is something an individual experiences, and if there's more individuals suffering, then the numbers tell you something about what the priorities, where the priorities should lie. I don't, of course, disparage or criticize anyone for working to improve life for pigs or cows or chickens or other farmed animals. Of course, that's very important work, but we should absolutely be including fish on that list.
But then we come to insects, which are even a higher number in the world, right?
Yes, although we're not factory farming them in huge numbers yet. There is some insect farming, crickets and such. But yes, who knows? Right now, the science is inconclusive. In a way, one could argue the science is always inconclusive on things like private things, like how another feels. I mean, I don't even know if you're a robot, Martin. I mean, it's conceivable. I don't buy into that. I think you're a human and you probably feel things much like I do. And we should think that way. But anyway, it is challenging to know what another being's experiences are, be they painful or pleasurable. My conclusion, based on what I've read, is that insects probably can feel pain in some ways, but not necessarily in the same ways that we do. Not all things that are painful to us are necessarily painful to an insect. Mm-hmm. Other things, they may be more painful to the insect, who knows? But it's the usual pattern. As we learn more, we scratch our heads more. We got more questions, and it's like, oh, maybe there is much more going on here. And an American biologist named Donald Griffin wrote quite a bit about animal minds, and he definitely thought we should be very open to the possibility that insects are sentient. It's useful to them to feel pain, so it's something they can move away from. So. Right. there's a number of reasons why we might think that. So I have a chapter in my upcoming book, Superfly, that talks about the evidence for mindedness, for intelligence in insects, and also sentience, the capacity to feel pain and pleasure.
Exciting. I really appreciate, or I look forward to reading that book. When is it coming out?
I think later part of 2020, so maybe August or September this year.
Because, as you said, it seems unclear about how much they can feel pain. Haven't there been much research on insects?
Not a lot, and not till recently, and even then there's not much now. But there has been in the last 20 years an increasing amount of research on pain, and I'm happy to say pleasure as well in insects. There was a recent study out of Israel suggesting that orgasm is pleasurable for male flies. Some clever genetic manipulations they did, and then some behavioral tests. So that's one study that I summarize in my book.
And we, of course, know much more about other animals like mammals, about their pain and also consciousness. But is it because we have focused more on them, or is it easier to do research on these other animals than insects because they are more different or smaller? Or
I'm glad you asked that, because it urges me to make a clarification on what I just said, which was very male-centered, and I want to give equal shrift to females. And that is that one of the reasons why there hasn't been as much study in female sex and possibility of pleasure in insects is that everything's internalized, so it's a little more difficult. However, there has been some studies suggesting that females find copulation rewarding. They also have a lot of control over what's done and how much and who does it and who fertilizes the female. So I wanted to mention that. On two levels. One is they're more different, and therefore we have to come up with new ways to study them. But also because they're more different, we've generally assumed that they don't have these capacities, and so it's harder to get funding maybe for a scientist to do studies like that. But again, that's changing.
And maybe lastly, you said something about what you would like to see in the future. Could you say something more about your vision? How should we relate to animals?
Well, it's the same issue, really. The ultimate thing that we must do is to stop eating them. And this isn't just in the interest of the animal welfare, it's in the interest of the planet. And it's satisfying and gratifying to see finally, after years and years and decades even of waiting, the media and the general awareness is picking up that animal agriculture is very destructive to the environment. That's been known for a long time, but it hasn't been talked about. It has been ignored or overlooked or just whatever. And now that willful ignorance is dissipating, is melting away. And so it's very important that we, on several levels, that we realize we cannot continue with the relationship we've had with animals, the relationship being kill them and put them on the end of a fork, chopsticks, and eat them. That has to change. That's the biggest priority we all face, is changing that. Doesn't mean that's the only thing we should do. But until we address that issue, we're really spinning our wheels. We're not going to get it done.
How long have you been a vegan?
About 35 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was a domestic vegan for a long time, where if I was out at a party or at a restaurant, I wouldn't ask if there was eggs or milk or something in something. But, I eventually worked for a vegan organization, so that helped push me to be...
You had to go vegan.
Yeah, that's right. Well, better late than never. But it's been 35 years since I became aware of the issue and that I stopped buying any animal product.
Was that also because of your studies in ethology?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think I was a vegan waiting to happen. I was always very upset if someone stepped on a cricket, or when I was a kid. I always loved animals and didn't want to harm them, so it was only a matter of time before I became enlightened enough to know that it was clearly harmful to them to eat them. And then once I knew that, being vegetarian was not enough, because I learned that the animals in the dairy industry, they also go to slaughter. They're just abused a bit more beforehand. It's probably worse for them. So it was very clear if I was going to be ethically inconsistent, I needed to stop eating their secretions. And when I turned vegan, it wasn't that hard. But now it's great. I mean, today on my phone, I could push in Happy Cow, and find a list of places to go. Great.
Yeah, did you find something good to eat here in Linköping?
Yeah, I actually ended up just going to one of many sushi places, and they had their menu outside, and they had a veg section. So it was simple and absolutely delicious. Yeah.
Now, lastly, I'm just curious, how many ethologists are vegan today? Would you have any clue?
No, I would not. There are some.
Yeah.
I have a friend, a long-term friend, who's an ethologist, and he's been veg and vegan as long as I have. Yeah.
I know a prominent ethologist here in Sweden. He says, "Oh, I'm against animal farming." I think he says, "I eat meat like maybe once a week." But I was thinking, is it because he would not be taken serious? Coming back maybe to this question among his colleagues, if he said, "Oh, now I'm a vegan."
I think it's social pressures that keep a lot of people from going fully vegan. It's nice to see that the former stigmas and negative attitudes about it are beginning to melt away, or they're melting away quite fast. Veganism now, with like films like The Changemakers and Forks Over Knives, is becoming not just unstigmatized, but vogue and pretty hip and pretty modern. I'm proud to wear my vegan sweater, you know.
Yeah.
So but of course I'd wear it even if there was dismissive attitudes about it, which there is among some people.
Yeah.
But get used to it, because that's the future.
And do you see a change coming?
I see positive signs that it may be coming. It's a bit frustrating because as the West is finally coming to its senses and beginning to decrease our consumption of meat and dairy products, which is very visibly happening in North America. Cheese companies and milk companies are going out of business. It's concrete cases of that happening. But as we in Europe and North America and such are starting to change our eating habits and to think about these things, Asia, with its huge populations, China and India, for instance, is continuing to increase its meat consumption. So the net
from very low levels, one must say, right?
Right. Yeah. Historically, their traditional diets were fairly low amounts of meat, and so the net result is the animal use is still increasing. However, the world is much smaller now with the internet and the way that information can be disseminated around the world. It gets picked up, so everything moves faster. Cultural and social change moves faster now, I think it's fair to say. And so these changes that we're seeing in developed nations are going to very quickly shift over to or be absorbed also by other parts of the world. So I think we'll see changes in human behavior and eating habits there as well.
Many change because of climate reasons, also for health issues, to eat more plant-based, right? But how about animal ethics? How many do you think change? And is that something that you see coming more and more?
I don't know. That's a great question, Martin. Certainly, most of the vegans I know are vegan because they're concerned about the animal ethics. But when you look at the bigger swath of society, I think it's personal stuff like the environmental hazards, which can affect you personally, and personal health. It'd be nice if economics was part of that, dollar signs and euro signs, because ultimately it's far more expensive to eat animals than to eat plant-based material. In America, I don't know about Europe, but we have huge subsidies, government subsidies that it makes a hamburger or a slab of meat seem much less expensive than it actually is. And of course that's economic cost. Then there's the environmental cost that we've already mentioned. So it's expensive on several levels. And of course if the animals had their say yes, there's another way it's costly. It causes us to suffer and have bad quality lives and lousy deaths.
Do you think we will ever see a world where we won't exploit animals, where we see them as someone, not something?
Not in our lifetime. But one can hope, and I think maybe what's going to do it is the technology. I live in a town of 50,000 people in Canada, about 2 hours east of Toronto, so it's not exactly the civilized hub of the world, and yet within 200 meters of my front door, there are 2 establishments at least that sell Beyond Burgers. One is a sports bar. And if I go into town half a mile, 1 mile away, or a couple of kilometers, there are now a growing number of establishments, including fast food places, that have all plant pizzas, plant-based burgers, and they're really, really good. I mean, okay, it's been 35 years since I've eaten a cow, ground up into a hamburger, but I don't go tasting vegan meat to see how it compares. I eat it to see how good quality it is, and I also like to support the company. I like to support this alternative, and the taste is excellent, and that's worth mentioning, because a lot of people eat for the taste, and until you get taste that they like, they're not going to change. So the meat companies better be probably pretty running a bit scared right now, because there's really fantastic alternatives that people are buying. And the milk is even more the case. I mean, the non-dairy milks, the oat milks, the soy milk, rice milk, hemp milk, cashew milk. The list goes on, and they're just taking up bigger sections of the supermarket shelves. So that's very exciting and very encouraging, and I hope that trend really, really snowballs and spreads worldwide as soon as possible.
Do you find Oatly in your supermarkets?
No, I think it's in North America, but whenever I read about it, occasionally it's all Europe. That's where it is. So I've heard that it's going to be spreading in North America. So I'm hopeful. I had some with my breakfast today.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking the time. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Sure thing, Martin. Real pleasure.
Great.